Alan Adamson, what one thing do you wish you'd have known 10 years ago?
Well, this may seem bizarre, but I wish I knew that you could use things like Zoom and Google Meetups and FaceTime, because 10 years ago, if I wanted to talk to a client, I would get on a plane and fly a long way for an hour meeting and then fly a long way back. And the simple piece of technology has made lots of what I do more effective. Now, it never will replace face to face and the importance of that. And I think some people push it to the virtual, bleeding edge. But if I had leaned a little bit more into technology, which was available 10 years ago, I would have made me more effective in business, I think.
Do you know, it reminds me of a conference presentation I saw a few years ago from British Airways, from BA. And the guy who was doing it, I forget his name, explained that on their he was talking about competitive analysis, and he was talking about the rise of Virgin and the sort of Virgin BA war that we had over here. Heathrow to JFK was the big route. And he made a point, just in passing almost, he said, I'm more worried about Skype as our competitor than I am about Virgin. And I just remember laughing and thinking, this guy's mad. He has no idea what he's talking about.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, I was wrong.
That is going to continuously change business travel to some extent. Although, as I think to it a little bit, while the technology was there, the social acceptability of saying, you're not important enough for me to get on a plane and see, how would you like to do a pre-conversation on something called Zoom or FaceTime? Socially, it was not as accepted, although the technology was there.
Yeah. I'm really fascinated, given your background, which we'll unpack in a moment, I'm really fascinated on your take on this question. How did Skype manage to blow the huge lead they have? In sporting terms, they were 50-0 up at half-time. How did they manage to blow that number one market position in video conferencing, video calling technology, to not even really existing as a format now?
Yeah, probably there's not one right answer, but one of the answers could be, in technology, I'm a believer in the Apple philosophy. If you have to read the instructions, you're already in trouble. And if it's not incredibly simple and child-proof, it won't work. And Zoom was so intuitive, easy, 2 clicks. Skype, you still had to. There was a phone book. They're calling out. There were too many buttons. And if you remember technology from 10 years ago, every piece of technology, be it a DVR or something like that, came with an instruction book that required a PhD in deciphering whatever language you had, because just because it has more capabilities doesn't make it a better solution.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that, Alan. That's a brilliant start to the show. Hey up, and welcome to the Strategy Sessions. My name is Andy Jarvis. I'm the host of the show and the first voice you heard at the beginning of this interview. The second voice you heard was Alan Adamson. Alan's an author, a branding expert, and a lecturer at one of the most prestigious universities in America. Alan's here to talk about his work, to talk about his books, and to talk about, being better marketers, really, and what that means, and give you some examples from some of the brands he's worked with. This is episode 1 of season 5. If you are new here, thank you very much for coming along. It means a lot, and thank you for giving the show a chance. There are a lot of podcasts out there, and I'm glad, grateful, whatever. I'm just happy you're here. If you're a regular, if you've listened to any of the previous 4 seasons, thank you very much as well. It's lovely to have people come back time and time again. Format is pretty similar this year. Interviews with experts, maybe going a little bit narrower and a bit deeper, but we'll see how it rolls out over the next 12 months. Quick reminder, episodes come out roughly every 2 weeks. I say roughly every 2 weeks. There are sometimes mini-series where there's maybe 4 or 5 episodes in a month. But broadly speaking, they're every 2 weeks with gaps at Christmas and stuff like that. And there's no podcasts go out over the summer, so it runs till about June. If you want to get in touch, my details are in the show notes. I love to hear from listeners. I love it when people get in touch. I love it when they agree with me. I like it even more when people disagree with me as well. So if you hear something on the show and you don't like it or you do like it, get in touch. Send me an email, LinkedIn, whatever. It's great to hear from people who listen. I'm a bit of a marketing geek. I love this. I love having the debates. I love having the chats. So this is my dream job. So I enjoy it. Get in touch. It'd be great to hear from you. Enough of me. Let's get back to Alan Adamson, because he's here to talk about the stuff that he's done, and it's much more interesting than hearing me waffle and do introductions. Before I go, though, please do like and subscribe to the show wherever you are. If you can leave a review, please do. It does make a huge difference to people discovering the show and to new people finding it. And also, if there's something on the episode you like, send it to a friend. Send them a WhatsApp message. Here, 10 minutes in, this guy talks about this thing. It's well worth a listening. It's a bit, it's useful for your business. That means a lot, and it helps to grow the listeners. So thank you very much. Enough of me waffling. Let's get back to the interview. Alan, welcome to the podcast, and thank you for coming on the strategy sessions.
Thanks for inviting me, and I look forward to a fun conversation.
So we are here primarily to talk about your book. If you're watching on YouTube, you'll see it's called Seeing the How, and it's transforming what people do, not buy, to gain market advantage. Now, we'll come back to that in a moment. First, I almost want to set the scene a little bit for what brought you to writing this book, by just talking about your resume for a little bit and your career to date, where you've been, where you've worked, because it's a kind of a who's who of some of the greatest companies in the world. So tell us a little bit about your history that got you to where you are now.
I became interested in marketing, and back in the day, if you were interested in marketing, a great place to train was in the world of consumer packaged goods, products people used to buy every day at something called a market or a supermarket or general store, be they cereals, be they shampoos, diapers. And in that world, the best place to get trained was in the world of consumer packaged goods, because as much as most companies don't want to talk about this, the difference between one bar of soap and the other bar of soap, or one shampoo and the other shampoo, or there are differences, but the differences are really small. So to succeed in those businesses where you're fighting for a customer's attention and preference and purchase decision every week, really put the emphasis on marketing, because the product differences often were never enough to say, oh my goodness, something called Zoom's out there, I better get it. There's nothing else like it.
Yeah, and what really fascinated me was you've worked at P&G and Unilever. Now, I could do a whole series just on ex P&G people and how they've taken over the world. I love the training. I love the ethos there. So tell us a little bit about your early days at P&G, and also maybe compare and contrast that to Unilever.
I spent many years at Unilever in what was called in the day product management, because you were assigned to a product, not even a brand back then, and your job was to worry about everything about that product, from how it was made, to how it smelled, how it worked, to how you communicated it, to how the sales force handled it, to how public relations happened. So it was like running a little company called Dove or Caress or any of the Unilever brands, and those were pretty big companies. In hindsight, they were, even back then, they were global brands with hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars in sales. So it was great training. And after many years of doing that, I learned I liked the creative end of the business more, the non-linear end, where the solutions could not be ascertained necessarily by plugging numbers into an Excel spreadsheet and seeing which column was 55 and which column was 45. So I went to the agency side, and that's where I didn't work at Procter & Gamble, but P&G was my client for many years on the agency side. And it was a good contrast, because when I was at Unilever, in the cafeteria, we would sit and not talk about the weather necessarily or what was going on in the news. We would sit, unfortunately, in our own little bubble there, saying, "Did you see what P&G did last week? And did you see what Colgate did? And what we, because that was the world we lived in." So to finally work in Cincinnati and go out to Procter & Gamble and learn how they, for the most part early on, were outsmarting both Colgate and Unilever, and to learn their process for how they drove successful marketing and successful business growth was a great experience. A lot of similarity because they were in many similar categories, and they used similar resources, big agencies, um, same distribution points. But there was a different philosophy at P&G, a little bit different, although looking from the outside, you'd have to look closely to see the difference between
Hmm.
shades of gray.
Yeah, I've done some work with I don't think I can say the brand names, but global brands that you know all know of, and their senior team in the UK element was led by someone who was ex P&G, but he was effectively the finance VP, finance director.
Right.
But he was the best marketer I've ever worked with because he'd done 15 years at P&G where finance
Mm-hmm.
people work embedded in teams with you know with the marketing team. They're just part that's their whole world, and it was such an eye-opening experience working with him and part of that team. It was just fascinating, and I love the sort of the way that you cut your teeth at places like Unilever and P&G.
Yeah, and my favorite lesson from many hours and time in Cincinnati learning from Procter and Gamble was that they at that time, forced their leaders or their managers or product managers or brand to, if they had something they wanted to do on a brand, they had to boil it down to a single sheet of paper. Management did not look at 40-page decks, 400-page emails, and that ruthless and relentless editing process to focus your thinking to say, I only have one page to tell the CEO what we're going to do with this brand. Here's the situation. Here's the choices. Here's my recommendation. Here's the rationale. Here's why it's right. Forced more precise thinking. And in marketing and in many parts of business, focus and precision is key. So if and unfortunately in today's electronic world, people think that writing long emails, there's no websites. I told my customer everything I wanted to know on a website, and you're scrolling through 15 pages of 40 reasons why this toothpaste may whiten your teeth, and
Hmm.
the reality is people would that's not the way you communicate. The way you communicate, in my first book was called Brand Simple. If you can't get it simple, you can't transmit the idea, and you can't get it in someone's head. So it may
Yeah.
be a great idea, but if it's 40 pages in PowerPoint, you might as well hit delete.
Yeah. Well, that skill of the one page was something I picked up in that project where, there was a presentation back and he was like, it's got to be, lovely. You didn't know this, but get it down to one page, then we'll talk again. Now,
Yeah.
I've since relented a little on the one pager because I think in P&G, one page was one sheet of paper, so you could use both sides of it, could you?
Well, you
Um,
can use smaller type. Let's just leave
yeah,
it at that. Smaller
yeah.
font size.
So you needed a magnifying glass to read it. So I now like as long as it'll go on two sheets of A4 in a standard size font, I'm happy. But yeah, it's a great idea to zoom in and focus on what the message is. So huge fan of that. So, and you mentioned you'd gone agency side, some big names there again, Ogilvy and Mather, and was it DMB and B?
Yeah.
I love agency names and getting them stuck in my teeth.
Alphabet
So how
soup.
was it jumping from sort of client side to agency side? Because it's quite a different world, isn't it?
Yeah, to some extent, I think it gave me some advantage because I had been a client. I knew where agencies fit in problem solving, and I knew what was mission critical to a client uh, from an agency, not just let's go to lunch and talk about how great our creative is, but how to frame the idea in a rational way. Because agencies are the bridge between the world of linear solutions and rationality of clients, where you have to have clear uh, strategies, to the creative world, where my creative teams, getting to the office in the days when you had to go to the office
Hmm.
was a challenge for many of my creative teams. They just operated. They saw the world differently, which is why they were so terrific. But they could look at a situation and see it differently. But getting them to live in the rational world, I was sort of the bridge, helping them bring their thinking, which had a different perspective than the client could even imagine, across the divide into the client world.
There's a guy I had on towards the end of the last season, James Hayhurst, who was also Unilever. He worked on Persil and I think it's called Ovo in some markets, is it?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, so he was sort of brand manager, global brand manager for that for a number of years. Then went agency side, some big agencies in the UK. DDB, Dane Doyle, Burnback, whatever
yeah,
that
yeah,
became in
yeah,
the UK.
yeah,
So, he worked at that version. And now has developed a program to help agencies and clients work better together and
yeah,
overcoming, those little bits of when you boil it down, what clients say they really want is actually they want to trust someone and they want challenging and they want to see great work. But how do you get to
right,
that great work? And it's not it's a difficult thing, isn't it, to bridge those two worlds? But when you get there, the outputs are fantastic.
yeah, and that interplay between the challenge clients have as they live, as I said earlier in the conversation. I was sitting at the lunchroom table at Unilever talking about Procter and Gamble and Colgate. In an agency, you have more of a horizontal world. The agency was working on not only consumer goods but credit cards, um, pharma products, and part of success in any business is having a peripheral view, and because innovation is oftentimes doing something from out of your category in your category. So agencies play a critical role. And while many people take it in house, the benefit of a great agency is in general, they have a wider lens view of the marketplace and might be able to spot trends and things that you, if you're deep in your bubble of your company, can't see.
Yeah. Now that almost sort of segues me into talking about your book because you mentioned fairly early on in it the great paper by Ted Levitt, Marketing Myopia, where you talk about marketers almost get stuck in that canteen where they love their product, they see their product every day, they're in product meetings and development and testing and so on and so on. And they forget that out there in the real world, the customer doesn't care. The customer
Yeah.
does not care about your product. And you mentioned the fact that you need empathy to be a great marketer. These sound from listening to you like lessons that have been hard won over the years, where you've kind of been through that and you've bought that T-shirt to say that you know that lesson now.
Yeah, and that sort of myopia is natural, and it's not only from being in a company. Oftentimes, from being in an industry, you work with a company that's been in the beer business, and you go talk to them, which I've done a couple times in my career, and they know how to market beer. This is how you do it, and it's learned, and this is the way we do things. This is how you optimize beer. You get it on premise, you promote it, but that sort of learning um, will ultimately handicap you because you're only until because disruption usually doesn't happen from your competitor. It's not like when I was working with Procter, Gillette was going to get out shaved by Schick. Although they were totally focused on seeing, Schick has 3 blades, let's go to 4 blades. And they were very much in that world of, as I say, playing tennis, just looking at the opponent and
Mm-hmm.
just keeping an eye on it. Where, they got disrupted, as everyone knows, by somebody outside the category who didn't know the rules, who said, gee, what's important for me is not how many blades, is remembering to buy new ones, and or the hassle of going to the drugstore to get them. And so, gee, I would like somebody to deliver them. Dollar Shave Club happened, a lot of others. So, you know, the challenge for most marketers is to know enough about your category to know success, but not so much that you're not having what I call fresh eyes. The ability to
Mm-hmm.
look at something and say, gee, you ever wonder why Andy wears a white shirt when he does his podcast? So you have to have fresh eyes, and it's really hard to do because people are creatures of habit.
And I think one of the other problems you see in the sector, and well, in marketing generally, is that if you've mentioned beer brands or Gillette or whatever, but if you want to go and work in a beer brand, often one of the criteria on the job application will be must have experience in the alcohol sector or in
Right.
in the CPG sector, something like that. And then you get in the door because you've got 10 years experience in the sector thinking like everybody else. And you go, we need an agency to do this. So you put out a tender for agencies, and what do you ask for? Must have experience of working in the sector. So all you get is just the same thinking going round and round and round because they've worked with this brand and this brand and this brand, looking at the same insights that they did last time and this time and this time. It just, you end up just doing derivative work. And
Yeah,
it's a difficult
that is a
roundabout to get
huge,
off.
huge problem. And people tend to hire people that went to the same schools and the same
Mm-hmm.
fraternities, and are in the same bubble. And
Yeah.
anyone who knows anything about innovation knows that it happens from the edges and the fringes. It doesn't happen at the core. And big companies struggle with that. I remember I had a conversation with HBO many years ago, and about why companies succeed and are able to shift ahead, and why some just get stuck in the mud. And they had a simple idea. I'm not sure they still do it. With instead of when you hire summer interns, most companies give them a pile of numbers to crunch, put them in a cubicle, and say you're there. Thank you very much. Have a good summer. Maybe they take them to a few meetings. But at HBO back in the day, they took a class of interns and gave each intern to somebody in the C-suite to educate the C-suite on entertainment trends, social media, digital,
Amazing.
and so because the young people coming in have a clear sense of what they need to do. The senior people sometimes do, sometimes don't, and then in the middle are people that are just have been in it for a long time and are risk averse. So
Yeah.
being able to see around the corner what's going on is critical for success in marketing, as everyone knows.
Yeah. And what an amazing learning experience for the interns as well. That'd be
Yeah, yeah,
tremendous. Yeah, more
yeah.
companies should do that.
Yeah.
You touched on a point though that you mentioned in the book, and I'm jumping all over, but I don't mind because I think it flows naturally. You mentioned in the book there's a section headed "Diversity Matters" where it comes to, I think it's right in the conclusion, and there's a lot of negativity. I will say there are certain people who maybe run platforms who've bought a succeeding platform and rebranded it and seems to be losing money hand over fist, who says that things like Boeing's problems are down to diversity and quotas and things like that. But actually you make a point that diversity when it comes to come up with ideas is a really important element of how you come up with the right stuff and how you get this sort of thing right, don't you? It's an important part of what you think.
Well, and I think also expanding the lens on diversity. It can mean the traditional things, but it could mean, instead of hiring 14 MBAs who spent forever reading Harvard Business School case histories and crunching numbers, the importance of getting someone with an English major or a philosophy
Mm-hmm.
major, someone who has a different, view of life. I remember I tell this story often, but when I was interviewing for my job at Ogilvy, I went through the day and I went to the CEO's office, and he said, "You've had a good day. How do you feel about things?" I said, "Well, I think I know marketing, and I'm really excited to work here at Ogilvy." And he said, "Well, I just have three questions for you, and then we'll see what happens. Tell me about the last museum you went to and what you found interesting. Tell me about the last Broadway show you saw, and tell me about the last book you read." And it was so far. I was ready to discuss media segmentation, research insights, and afterwards I said, Ken, why did you ask me? He goes, "I want our agency leaders to be our clients' eyes and ears, to help them see over the horizon. And so while you need to know their craft, we need to hire people that you know who are fully immersed in the world around them and not just smart, geeky marketing experts."
So I think that's fascinating that Ogilvy asked those questions because I was reading something on LinkedIn, which, LinkedIn's LinkedIn, but it was a business leader here in the UK who was saying something like, I don't see the point in reading fiction. I'd much rather read business books. And I just felt it was such terrible advice almost, in terms of whether just reading business books felt like it was just dragging us back into this sort of narrow segment, and getting out and seeing theatre and reading different books is a way to stay in touch, especially as marketers, with with what's going on with the world around.
Right? Because
But I am intrigued.
successful marketing is seeing not only what's going on right now, but seeing something a little bit down the road, so you can have a chance to think about it, react to it, and optimize, as opposed to, oh my God, how'd this trend happen? We're not ready for it.
And what was the last Broadway show you've seen?
I forget. Yeah, but I do think that's important for any marketer, not just for advertising, is to get out of your category, meet people from other categories, meet people who do something totally different, and make sure you're in touch with how people are living and what they're thinking, not just do they prefer this pizza over that pizza because of the cheese.
Yeah. So there's something about this book that really spoke to my soul, in that I did some research once, and ad hoc research, relatively recently, at an e-commerce conference. So it was a performance marketing conference, and I asked the room, how many of you have spoken to a customer? A conversation, could be over the phone, could be in person, but actually exchanged words with a customer in the last 6 months. And it was 3% of the room. And I was like, this is just weird. Maybe it's just it. So I then did a little bit more formal research into this. And in performance marketing, it's always about 3%. Now, I was talking about this on LinkedIn, and somebody linked me to the, was it Michael Porter, who did a study with Fortune 500 CEOs where they were 2% of their time they spent with customers. And I started to, so one of the things that I repeatedly talk about on this podcast, in work, on stage with with an audience at conferences, is the importance of talking to your customers. Because it's amazing what you find out when you actually get out from behind your desk and go and speak to them. And as I was reading through this book, I got a sore neck just nodding along, going, yep, So yeah, you'd spoken to Susie Deering from Ford, and she had introduced Ford renewing speaking to customers. Tell us about that and how and why that happened.
Well, the automotive business is one of those classic businesses that's in a bubble. People have been in the auto business a long time. They go from Ford to Nissan to it's a echo chamber.
Mm-hmm.
And Susie came in from a different category. She was in telecommunications, where I met her at Verizon, and she wanted them to start thinking about their business different than car makers, and was looking at different categories, mostly for experience. And she was very focused on, hospitality as a great learning platform for cars, because cars, like many other products, which is a premise of my books and where we started our conversation, the differences between one car and the other, maybe the coffee cup holder is here, the coffee cup holder is here. You can get in a rental car, as you know, and you have no idea what car it is. It could be a luxury car, it could be it's a sea of sameness. And so what's going to differentiate a car experience going forward, and many other experiences, is not where the coffee cup holder goes, or how many miles per gallon it gets, or how many miles per charge it gets. It's going to be, what is the experience of ownership like, from learning about it to inevitably needing to repair something to moving on to your next vehicle. And so she was really talking about that just marketing cars the way cars have always been marketed needed to change. And she was looking out of the category for experiences.
I just found it so fascinating that Ford hadn't, a great company like Ford, had for so long delegated their customer interaction to the dealerships and the dealership network, and they were only asking a question.
Players, they're retailers. They can't take the long-term view. They're smaller businesses, and to have that critical point of touch be not your best experience, is, and it's still a problem today. It is a huge problem across the category.
I did some research for a client in the leasing sector of automotive in the UK last year, and I can reiterate that it is still a problem. We asked questions, it was a female audience. We were looking at a particular problem that this retailer had. And we sort of asked lots of women in focus groups, what's your experience of going to a car dealership? And I think over maybe a dozen focus groups, 120-ish people, one person said something positive. One person. Now,
Yeah, and
probably
it's
half
so
of them
stuck in
said
the past.
awful things. Awful.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the sales leader in most auto situations is not empowered to make the decisions that matter in terms of
Hmm.
pricing or anything like that. It's like going to a front desk at a hotel and saying, "I don't like my room," and the person saying, "Well, I have to call headquarters. I'm not sure." If you don't empower your customer service people to solve your problem or to
Hmm.
understand your problem, back when I was at Landor, we did a bunch of work for BMW, and the whole model of a dealership had to change, and they were looking at different touch points, different experiences. And the big difference is when you go in to buy a car today, as you undoubtedly know, you've already done homework. You've looked online,
Hmm.
yet the person approaches you with none of that knowledge. She says, "Well, let me tell you what I've got. I've got a great car here, and I know you're going to love it." But if he was really integrated into the digital ecosystem, he'd already know that you're looking at white cars. This is key. This is the cars you're looking at. He'd know something about you. He'd have a customer insight saying, Andy is really looking for efficiency. And, but now they go in close and they go through their sales pitch as if you're landing from
Yeah.
Mars.
And worse, they make a lot of, certainly over here anyway in the UK, the research we did would suggest they make a lot of assumptions. So, a common theme that came back from some of the women we spoke to was, as the women walked in to buy a car, they'd be like, "Oh, so here's our family cars over here." And one of the women said, "I just had a pay rise to take me to director level in a company, or VP level in a company.
I want to
I
get a
was going
Porsche.
in for, yeah, I was going in for the fancy car for the
Yeah.
motorway miles." And they were like, "So, this car you can get push chairs in the back of." And she was like, "I don't have any children. I'm here for one of those." And it was almost incredulous, the response that they got, "Oh, are you sure?" And I mean, that stuck out, and you're thinking, how do you run a business like this? But the demand is there, so they just, I don't know. I don't know. We'll leave the car segment.
People think they can look at somebody and say, "Well, you're in a white T-shirt. That means you must be a former soccer player." And so we're going to talk about sports.
Yeah, it happens all the time, all the time. So, yeah. But the car industry is a great one because I think a lot of people know about it. But you also talk a little bit about Apple in the book. Now, there's two things. I love talking about Apple, and I want to sort of unpack that story. But I'm going to ask you at the end, what can other people learn from this? Because not everyone has Apple's revenues and money and investment opportunities. So you talked about the Genius Bar being a genius idea. So why is that? What is it about the Genius Bar that really worked for you?
Well, it ties back to the beginning of our conversation. The big issue with tech is what happens if it's not working. My mic is not working, my videos. And, when you deal with most customer service across most categories, you're dealing with call centers, you're talking on the phone, you have to wait. And when when you're dealing with a mission critical thing like a phone these days,
Hmm.
um, you know, you want to say, "Andy, this is not working." You want somebody right there. You don't want to be on hold and talk to a chat bot for 20 minutes and then, re-enter your information. So I think the Genius Bar was the first understanding that the way the technology was going to be won by the person that could make technology most usable and the experience better, not necessarily the one who will have the best battery life and the most screen resolution.
Yeah.
Um, and even I just did another story a long time ago when I was in London, I guess about a year and a half ago. It was the first time I ever just walked around London with just a phone. I didn't take my wallet, and I just had some ID. And as you know, you can buy everything from a water on the corner to a fancy sports car with
Hmm.
your phone these days. Um, and when I looked at what Apple had done, so there were many ways they could have done innovation, but just putting the magnet on the back so you could clip on, a couple in case you needed an ID or in case you needed, a a little bit of what people used to call cash. But that little innovation, when you ask somebody, "What do you want in a phone?" they would have said better battery life, maybe more resilience when I drop it in the shower. but thinking about how that phone fits into someone's life and making that piece interesting. I think Apple does that. A lot of people do that, but I think that's the key to success is not asking them what they want from the product, but looking at how that product fits into someone's life.
And I think this is what Apple do really well, and probably the lesson I say to people to take from Apple. I often have people throw the Steve Jobs quote about, we don't ask people what they want. It's kind of a reworking of Henry Ford's quote about a faster horse. But,
Right.
people say Apple famously don't do market research. And I go, no, they do. They do an awful lot of market research, but they just don't ask you, what do you want from the product? They watch
Right.
how you use the product and improve it
Right.
based on that insight.
Yeah, and part of being a good listener is asking the right questions and listening. And more important today is observational. People don't even realize how they behave, and yeah, if you're watching them, and you can't watch them by reading a research report that says 22% of our customers prefer white T-shirts versus blue T-shirts. Um, just watching them with a bit of a what I used to call a bit of a from the old Seinfeld episode a bit of a head scratch. You ever wonder why people do that? And you need to wonder why people behave in certain way, not just say, well, this person always does this. Um, Part of success is wondering why and trying to figure out why.
This is the bit that terrifies me about that 3% of e-commerce marketers who never get out from behind the screen. Now, I know that the gods of efficiency, tell us that because we can pull that report and look at those numbers and look at the click-through rates and this, that, and the other, that, hey, well, why do we need to do this? But this is essential, isn't it? It's not just important, it's essential to being better marketers, is to understand how people use the thing that we're selling them and what impact it has on their daily routines.
Yeah, because most marketers, as many marketers, are in the business of optimizing. How do we, go from this to that? And optimizing can take your business, a long way to
Mm-hmm.
profit, more growth. But at a certain point, just optimizing what is going to end. You're going to end up in the Radio Shack land and the brands that whatever happened to those brands. Because to be successful as a marketer, which is one of my main premises of the book, you should think of yourself as half marketer or maybe less, and half chief of innovation. You need to be figuring out what's your next best. How are you going to innovate and change something? Not how do you tell somebody why your existing product is 2% better than what they can get from someone
Uh,
else.
do you know Rory Sutherland, who's the current vice chair of Ogilvy UK?
I don't know him, but I've listened to
Uh,
him, and because I was a WPP, and obviously he was a very important thought leader
yeah.
back in the day.
So Rory's been on the strategy sessions twice. I'm lucky to say, and both were exactly how you would imagine them to be. But on one of those episodes, he tells a story about when in his early days, he was a copywriter for American Express, and this was direct mail, and every year they tested and optimized the letter that they sent out to get people to
Mm-hmm.
sign up. They'd add an extra paragraph, they'd tell them something else nice, they'd do that sort of thing, and they went from a 3-paragraph punchy sales letter, which then added an extra paragraph, an extra line, to 2 pages, and at each time it increased conversion by 1%, 2%, 1%, 2%. It kept going up and up. But then the cost of mailing a third sheet was going to be so expensive that they went, okay, what are we going to do? So they then hacked the whole letter to pieces and went back to 2 or 3 paragraphs, and sales went up about 20% because they
Right,
stopped optimizing just based on incremental improvements and had to come at it a completely different way. And I just
exactly.
love that story for how a change in mindset can actually radically change your results in what you're doing
Right,
in marketing. And I think that's the sort of thing you're talking about as well.
right. It's non-linear thinking. If two blades shape better than one blade, well, let's go to 3 blades. So and once you're on that linear path, yeah, it's usually a clear sign that you will be successful in the short term and probably not in the medium term.
Yeah, and that there's so much short term thinking. I was reading about Costco, and they have sort of 4 principles of how they run their business, because shareholder return is not one of their 4 principles of how they run their business. They say that if you look after, because they have a fixed operating margin, was it 11%? I
Right.
think it
Yeah.
is. Yeah. So they said, look after the customer, look after your staff. There's got the four things. They say if you do these four things, we will provide a good shareholder return. And
Right.
what I loved about that was it actually promoted medium to long term thinking. Because the short term thinking would be at Costco, ramp that margin up to 25%, 30%, even 100%, which is not uncommon in retail and more. But
Mm.
that's the short term thinking if you have shareholder return as your objective. I
Yep.
just wonder, how do you think that, the Friedman doctrine of shareholder return is kind of all conquering? How do you think that plays into how marketers have to operate?
Yeah, I mean, it's the biggest challenge any forgetting marketing all businesses face is how to, and why companies that have the luxury of not needing to manage their business quarter to quarter, like an
Mm-hmm.
Amazon or perhaps even an Apple, but they have to pay attention to that, can take a longer view and ultimately uh, not just get a slightly better mousetrap, but win the race. So, in marketing, you need to always focus on the things you talk about, which is how do I break out of my linear thinking,
Mm-hmm.
and you know what problem should I be solving, and zooming out from the product.
Yeah, perfect. I There's also something else you mentioned, Radio Shack. We didn't have that brand in the UK, but was that a rental place for radios, TVs, and things in the
No, it
60s,
was a it
70s,
was a
80s?
low end electronic store that sold electronic devices, phones,
Mm-hmm.
headphones,
Gotcha.
low price monitors, and it got caught in part of the Amazon squeeze because you
Mm-hmm.
know you would often go to a store and you'd ask for, do you have a case for this phone? You can't see it on here, um, and they would say, no, we're out of stock, whereas Amazon is never out of stock. So and they got into the business. It was an interesting story tied to what we were just talking about. They had a very successful um, advertising idea in the day, and it was, you've got questions, we've got answers, and it already understood that in technology, solving problems was more important than selling stuff. But they didn't go through the step of training their employees how to answer those questions. They were just low price, people in the store who were used,
Oh dear.
and used to selling, not telling you why your thing is glitching. And so when people went in and said, "Look, I got this little problem," and they got, "I don't know, look it up online." So again, they thought their business was a retailer selling low price or good low margin, good prices on electronic stuff, but their business really was, how do I create an experience for these customers that makes them come back and come back, because you can get low price anywhere, and we
Mm-hmm.
will unlikely be the lowest price solution given uh, the change in digital.
And the work you do now, Metaforce, which is a kind of an A team like consultancy that brings together the experts to go and solve problems. Because problems like you've just described with Radio Shack always look really simple in hindsight, don't they? Kodak disappearing. You look and you
Right,
go, well, of course they should have made this move. But
right.
you're going in now when the companies are not at the end of that process having won or lost, but in the teeth of that. What sorts of things are you looking for to help you spot the problems and fix them? Because in a big organization, it can be hard to really peel the layers of the onion back to actually find what the real problem is, can't it?
Yeah, and oftentimes when somebody will set out and say, "Here's our problem in a company," and find someone to help us, and they will find somebody, and they'll say, "Here's our problem. This pencil is not working." Um,
Mm-hmm.
and everyone instantly says, "Well, that's the problem. Let's think about how to make that better." But you don't have people in that ecosystem that can say, "Well, wait a second. Yeah, are you sure it's the pencil's problem? Are you sure? How are people using it? And to really push back in that situation, having been in agencies, part of the challenge of running an agency is you would take a senior person like Andy. He would talk to the client, bring the client in, be there for key meetings, and then most of the time your team would be doing the day to day. But if you've got and that's okay if you're needing to optimize something, But if you got a really tough problem and only have one senior person that's sort of in it sometimes and not in it other times, um, tougher problems require, I think, a horizontal team. I hate to go back to this, but in previous uh, uh, before this change in marketing and advertising, it was so focused on optimization and pressure. When you were doing a campaign or a brand idea for Procter and Gamble, you had 3 or 4 people on the team that were really senior, the research team, the planning team, the creative team, the account team. They would spend time together as a bunch of senior people and solve the problem. Later in the world of marketing, you would have one senior person and many very competent junior people. But so that's what led to the special forces. That to solve tough problems, you need a horizontal team, deep expert, and the ability to push back and say, "Are you sure it's the yellow pencil's problem?" And if you've only been in business 10 years, it's hard to push back against Andy, who's been in business more than 10 years, and say, "You just told me you have a yellow pencil problem, but let me tell you what your real problem is."
Yeah. And it's really hard for junior people as well to tell their boss, to go, I don't think you're right, actually. That's quite, not every organisation gives you credit for challenging the senior person in a room full of other juniors, do they? So.
Well, that's part of your diversity thing, because, if you're all, yes, that's great. Everyone wants, saying no to anybody in a company or saying I have a different is really hard. Especially the more senior the person saying the answer is yellow pencils, the harder it is to say, well, wait a second, who's using pencils these days?
Just as we're wrapping up, and we talked a little bit about Metaforce, but there is one part of your career we've not talked about. It's your work with the university, NYU Stern. I forgot that name right.
Yeah.
Because we talked a bit about juniors and people coming into the organisation and diversity of thinking. And I do a little bit of lecturing. The organisation's not quite as prestigious as yours, but it's great to do, and I love it. But what do you learn from sort of working with upcoming and aspiring brand marketers?
Well, so the first thing I learned is that lots of young people today do want to go into marketing, but they want to be entrepreneurs. They want to do things differently. They want to break business models, and so it forces me to have fresh perspective on technology and why they're doing things. I don't think marketing as a theory is that hard. What makes great marketing is not go talk to the customer, find out what they want, give them what they want, deliver. What makes marketing hard is great execution. And getting that execution right is an iterative and so by working with students, I can see quickly that they understand the theory, but there's a big gap between knowing how to take a tennis ball and hit it in theory and take a tennis ball and hit it in reality. And I think the same is true in business. And so working with them to start to help them understand the theory is a framework, but how well you execute the theory will make you more successful than knowing exactly what the theory is.
Yeah. No, brilliant. And it's I love that they are challenging you, and it forces you into a new perspective too, because you never stop learning, do you? That's the great thing about this sector, this industry.
They can look at they are the ultimate, going back to the beginning of the ultimate case of fresh eyes. They look at the world and say, why is everything done this way when I could do it differently?
Yeah,
and should do
absolutely, and should, yeah, absolutely. So, Alan, thank you. Tell me, how do people find you? We've obviously got a link to your website in the show notes, but what's the best platform for people to find you and find out more about your?
They can reach out to me at Metaforce, or I do a lot of public speaking or at NYU, or and if they've listened to me on your show, they should mention that versus a random inbound text. I'm always happy to talk to people and kick around ideas, and it makes what's fun about this business, as you undoubtedly know, is the best ideas come out of collaboration and shared thinking, not out of sitting one-on-one staring at a screen.
Or forcing everybody into a boardroom for an hour to come up with a new idea. Like, no,
Exactly.
that's not how it works. So,
Right. Exactly.
brilliant. Listen, Alan, I'm holding the book up for those watching online again. Seeing the How is available now. There's a link in the show notes where you'll be able to buy that book. Definitely worth a read. And Alan Adamson, thank you very much for your time on the strategy sessions.
I've enjoyed it, and thanks for inviting me.